Good morning, friends, and welcome back to my kitchen. Today I'm going to be sharing with you a few meals from the past week, focusing on ingredients from our Homestead pantry. Now that we are into January, I am trying to get back to a place of more meal planning and shifting my focus back to cooking based on what we have stored after the holidays. We are still very well stocked from garden season, and so I want to make sure we are getting through things before we're back into it. It has barely felt like winter yet here, but I know garden season is going to creep up on us really quickly, and so I want to make sure that everything is being utilized. So with all that mentioned, the focus is using what we have, and right now we have a ton of eggs. The first recipe that I'm sharing with you in today's video is a staple for us, and that is frittata. Frittatas are a staple around here and something that I make quite often, particularly when we have lots of eggs. Now, winter is usually when the chickens slow down on their laying, but ours are really just ramping up right now because we got a handful of new layers later in the summer, so we are just swimming in eggs right now. The frittata that I'm making today is a go-to for me. I just whisk up a bunch of eggs. Today I'm doing 8 and I season them with a little bit of salt and pepper. Today I'm also doing some chili flakes and then some fresh rosemary. Fresh rosemary in a frittata is my favorite as far as herbs go. I added that in there along with a bit of fresh shredded Parmesan cheese. And then I'm heating my cast iron skillet over medium-low and I'm dicing some onion. I'll add that into the pan with some butter. After a couple minutes, I'm also adding in some steamed frozen kale. I just froze it in pucks when we had tons coming in from the garden, and it's great to have on hand for all sorts of things. I use these a lot when I'm making soups as well. Letting that kale saute a little bit as well, and then I'm going to pour in the egg mixture. And I'll allow that to cook for a minute or two, and then this is going to get transferred to a 350-degree oven for just a couple minutes until it's cooked through. This is a go-to as far as flavor combinations for frittata, also great with added sun-dried tomatoes as well. The cooler months means soup on repeat, and we were due for another batch. I always start this out with carrots, onions, garlic, and some celery, but I realized today that we had finished the last of the celery from the garden that I had in the freezer, so no celery today in this batch. I'm heating my Dutch oven over medium-low heat with just a bit of cooking fat in it. For meat today, I am doing a pound of grass-fed ground beef, and I'll let that brown, breaking it up as it cooks. Once the beef is mostly cooked through, I'm adding in all those veggies. Allow those to cook for a few minutes until the beef is fully cooked and the veggies have softened. And then I'm seasoning all of that with plenty of sea salt and pepper. All of the canned ingredients that I'm using in this soup are home canned, so they have little or no salt in them. I don't add any salt to my home canned broth, so I am salting this pretty heavily. I'm also adding in some Italian seasoning, just a mix of dried basil, oregano, parsley, and rosemary. I'm also adding in some beans to the soup. Today I'm using a pint of home canned kidney beans, so draining and rinsing those as well. To my pot, I'm adding in 2 quarts of home canned chicken broth, as well as some roasted tomato sauce. This is one of my favorite ways to preserve garden tomatoes. It adds so much flavor. Roasting really brings out the sweetness, and it's super easy to do. Just roasted tomatoes blended and cooked down into a sauce, and I'm using 1.5 pints of that, and then I just rinse the jar out with a little bit of water as well to make sure that none got left behind. Also adding in those kidney beans, then bringing this up to a boil. I also decided to add in some pasta in here last minute, so just a small amount of macaroni is what I ended up doing. Usually I like to use a ditalini in soup, but I didn't have any on hand. Turning down the heat to a simmer, adding a lid, and I will allow that to simmer maybe 15 minutes or so until the noodles are fully cooked. I didn't have one today, but I always save the rind from Parmesan cheese as well, and I like to add that into soups or sauces as they simmer, which is going to add a ton of good flavor as well. This makes for a really simple soup recipe, really hearty, and it makes great leftovers for lunch. Since we began raising pigs for meat, I have had to learn how to cook pork chops. It's not something that we ate a whole lot of before we began raising our own meat, and if you've ever raised your own pork, you know you end up with a ton of pork chops. So I'm always looking for new ways to cook them, but most of the time I want to keep it pretty simple, and apples and pork are just a match made in heaven. These are really quick and easy to come together. So for these pork chops with apples, I am thinly slicing a red onion, as well as a couple of apples, and then I'm finally chopping a tablespoon or so of fresh rosemary. Once I have everything chopped and ready to go, I got my cast iron skillet heating over medium with a bit of cooking fat. I'm using lard today. It's really nice to have a fat source to cook with that came right from here. I cook primarily with animal fats. You'll see in this video that I like to use butter, but if you've seen the price of butter, it has gotten pretty pricey these days, so I'm trying to utilize more of the lard that we have. I'm still using lard from last year, but I have another batch that is ready to be rendered down pretty quick here. Once that skillet was nice and hot, I added in my pork chops and I got those seasoned with a little bit of salt and pepper, and I'm going to get those browning on both sides for a few minutes. After that, I'll remove them from the pan, set them aside, and add in the onions, apples, and rosemary to cook down for a few minutes. As those apples and onions are cooking, I have another small cast iron skillet heating over medium heat. I add in a bit of lard again, and as a side, I am heating up some of our home canned green beans from the garden. I find that the best way to do this is by heating them really quickly over a higher heat, and that helps to avoid them becoming mushy and overcooked. But the variety also plays into it. My go-to are Seychelles. They're a pole bean variety, and they are my favorite for fresh eating, freezing, or canning. I feel like they just end up having the best texture after that. After a few minutes of the apples cooking, I am adding back in the pork chops along with about a half cup of broth. At this point, I would add in a bit of grainy mustard, but I was all out of that, so I just kept this as is. These turned out so delicious, super simple, healthy, and a good staple for us with what we're able to grow here in the fall, or if we have stored our apples well. This is something that we can make with 100% homegrown food, and that always gets me really excited. Something I've not had in a very long time before this were cabbage rolls. I know not everyone gets as excited about these as I do, but I love them. I end up freezing quite a bit of cabbage from the garden, so sometimes I will do deconstructed cabbage rolls or cabbage roll inspired soup, but I wanted to make the full thing today. To start, I got a large pot of water going and I cut the core out of a green cabbage. Once that water had come up to a boil, I added in the head of cabbage and I'm allowing that to simmer for a few minutes until the outer leaves begin to soften. Then I'll remove it from the water, pull off those outer leaves, and sometimes I find as you get closer to the middle, it needs a little bit more time in the water. For the filling, I'm starting out with dicing some onion and chopping up lots of garlic. Typically, I do yellow onion here, but I only had red on hand, so we are making do with that. When I remove the cabbage head from the water, I like to transfer it to a baking sheet so that I don't end up with water all over the counter, and you can see just how easily those outer leaves peel off. Now to continue on with the filling, I'm getting started on some rice. Added some rinsed rice to a pot with some water. I'm doing a cup of rice, and then I'm just going to bring that to a boil, reduce the heat to a simmer and cover with a lid, as you typically do for rice, and I am just partially cooking it today. So I ended up cooking it about 8 minutes, that way it won't be overcooked after baking the cabbage rolls. In a hot skillet with a bit of butter, I am cooking up a little over a pound of ground pork. Got that going for a few minutes, and once it was partially cooked, I added in some seasonings. So I'm doing lots of dried parsley, fresh is even better, but again, using what I've got. I also added in a bit of dried dill, lots of salt, and lots of pepper. Once the pork was mostly cooked, I added in the diced onion and garlic and continued to cook until the pork was fully cooked through. Once the pork mixture was fully cooked, I stirred in the white rice. Now, typically I would add in diced tomatoes here, but I did some of the roasted tomato sauce instead today, just so that I could finish up a full jar without having leftovers in the fridge. Stirred that all together, and then I was ready to start assembling the cabbage rolls. To assemble them, I'm taking a cabbage leaf, cutting out a bit of the rib if I need to, and then I'm adding about 1/3 of a cup or so of the filling, folding in the sides, rolling them up, and then just placing them seam side down into a 9x13 pan that I have a little bit of tomato sauce in the bottom of. Once I had those all assembled, I topped them off with a bit more tomato sauce, covered the pan with foil, and those are going to bake for an hour and 15 in a 350-degree oven. There you have it, a few recipes from this past week focusing on using up what we have in our Homestead pantry. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season and a great start to 2025. We are slowly getting back into the swing of things and back into routine after a couple weeks of lots of board games, puzzles, reading, and just relaxing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.